You think wearing a white suit makes a black woman clean enough to sit in my courtroom? The officer roared, his hand choking her neck like he was crushing both her skin and her dignity. He yanked her hair, kicked the chair over, eyes wild like he'd just been injected with the dirtiest kind of American power. To him, justice was a toy for white men, and the law a leash for black bodies. But what he didn't know, the woman he was choking was the wife of the state police chief, a man who could turn him from badge wearer to national disgrace with one phone call. That choke wasn't just an assault. It was the moment he strangled his own career, his badge, and the illusion of supremacy he'd clung to all his life. If you saw this happen, would you rise like a storm or bow your head like a shadow? What state do you live in? The courtroom air snapped like a taut wire as he lunged forward, his scarred hand slicing through the sterile space to clamp around her throat. "No one stops me," he roared, voice tearing through the chamber like a blade, echoing off marble walls and ricocheting into the shocked silence of dozens of onlookers. His fingers, marred by deep, jagged scars that snaked across his knuckles, wrapped around her neck with a force that felt inhuman. The cords of his forearms stood out, gnarled and tense, like thick ropes pulling her closer to the brink. Her white suit, pristine and almost luminous under the harsh fluorescent lights, absorbed the first thin thread of blood that crept from her collarbone, staining the ivory fabric with a dark, vivid crimson that seemed to pulse with each ragged breath. She didn't scream. Her lips tightened, her nostrils flared as she pulled in a fragmented gasp, but no sound broke from her throat. Her eyes, sharp and unblinking, pierced him with an unspoken defiance, a quiet war raging in those obsidian depths. In her right hand, her fingers dug into the folder marked boldly with the police department insignia, as if it were the last thread tying her to sanity, to identity, to the raging pulse beneath her skin. The documents crumpled under her trembling grip, but she didn't let go, not even when his hot, sour breath bathed her face in waves of primal rage. His eyes bulged, veins webbing across the whites like fractures in ice, and his mouth curled into a grotesque snarl that revealed yellowed teeth, jagged as broken glass. His breath rasped like a dying animal, each exhale rattling through clenched teeth, as if the simple act of breathing was too generous for the creature he had become. He lowered his face close to hers, the words spilling out in a venomous hiss. "Here, I am the law. You don't deserve to breathe." The sentence slithered into her ears, heavy and vile, settling into her bones like poison. She didn't answer. Her chest heaved once, violently, but her gaze never faltered. Blood slid down her neck, tracing a delicate yet brutal path across her collarbone, merging with the growing blot on her once immaculate suit. Every drop was a silent scream, a testament to the violation of dignity that unfolded before dozens of stunned faces. The courtroom, usually a temple of hushed authority, turned into a stage of primal violence, the thick stench of sweat and metallic blood tainting the sterile air. Cameras, once aimed to capture judicial decorum, now quivered in trembling hands. The jurors leaned back, some clutching their mouths, others frozen mid-breath, yet no one moved. No one dared to intervene. Fear anchored them to their seats, a collective paralysis feeding the monster before them. His thumb pressed deeper into the delicate hollow of her throat, her skin blanching under the merciless force. His other hand flexed by his side, ready to strike again, the nails ragged and filthy, trembling in a dance of suppressed violence. She remained still. Her left hand, fingers pale and knotted with tension, steadied the folder against her chest, as if guarding her very essence. Her eyes narrowed slightly, scanning his wild gaze, dissecting his madness piece by piece. He panted, his chest rising and falling in spasms, sweat streaming from his forehead and soaking the collar of his uniform. The uniform's once pristine badge glinted under the courtroom lights, a sick parody of justice now tarnished beyond repair. His voice dropped to a ragged whisper. splintered and dripping with venom. Beg me for the air you think you deserve." He leaned even closer, the coarse stubble on his jaw scraping her cheek, leaving raw streaks in its wake. His words fluttered her ear, hot and rotting, but she remained an unyielding pillar. She felt the tremor in his arm, the surge of desperation lacing his violence, a grotesque dance of power slipping through his fingers. In that moment, her silence was a blade. Every tremor of her restrained breath mocked him, her unbroken gaze a mirror reflecting his cowardice, his fear hidden beneath layers of brute force. The blood continued to spread, a red flower blooming against the cold white of her vest, each petal a silent vow that this would not end as he expected. Her lungs clawed for oxygen, her face tinged with blue at the edges, but her grip on the folder never faltered. Her body refused to yield. The audience, hypnotized by the scene's raw savagery, became statues. Silent witnesses to a ritual of public humiliation, a grotesque unmasking of power and impotence. Every breath he stole from her seemed to fuel his animalistic need to dominate, to reduce her to an object beneath his hand. Yet every second she remained conscious, every second her eyes refused to dim, deepened the cracks in his manic facade. He snarled again, voice cracking under its rage. "I said beg," but she wouldn't. Her lips, chapped and faintly quivering, parted slightly, as if to inhale the final shred of air, but instead of surrender there was only iron resolve. His fingers twitched around her throat, veins popping, eyes flickering with a manic sheen that teetered on the edge of collapse. The standoff became its universe, an arena where two souls collided in brutal silence, one wielding violence, the other wielding unwavering spirit. She inhaled, a fragile, broken sound that somehow roared louder than his scream. In that moment, it wasn't him choking her. It was her defiance that threatened his very sense of invincibility. She was the still center of a hurricane, her steady stare carving through the fury that consumed him. Blood pooled in the hollow above her sternum, dripping down in a slow, rhythmic cadence, marking time like a funeral drum. His face contorted into something monstrous, spit foaming at the edges of his mouth, his jaw unhinged in a wordless shriek. He was no longer a man. He was an animal, cornered, flailing against a truth he couldn't crush. His hand, once so certain, now shook, trembling as if it sensed the futility of its violence. Yet he couldn't stop. He couldn't let go, because letting go meant admitting defeat, facing the abyss that opened beneath his feet. Her fingers twitched around the folder, a quiet declaration of sovereignty. Her pupils dilated, black wells that drank in every flicker of light, every shudder in his muscles. Her breath rattled again, but her spine stayed straight, her shoulders squared, as if she stood in front of an army rather than kneeling beneath his hand. The red stain spread further, an irreversible wound blooming across her chest like a grotesque rose. Yet it did not diminish her. It transformed her into an icon of silent, defiant resistance. Above them, the courtroom lights buzzed softly, a sterile chorus to the macabre scene below. No one moved. No one stopped him. And yet in that frozen instant it was clear. She had already stolen from him the only thing that mattered, his dominance. His voice, now a strangled gurgle, spat curses that splattered against her cheek, each one sliding down with the same useless desperation as the sweat drenching his face. She watched him, unblinking, her every heartbeat a drumbeat of quiet revolt. The final seconds stretched like centuries, every pulse of blood a rebellion, every shallow gasp a refusal to bow. She did not beg, she did not break, and as his fingers bore down, turning her skin into a mosaic of bruises and blood, she stood undefeated within her silence. The courtroom, saturated with the sharp stench of fear and iron, bore witness to a single thunderous truth. He could scream, "No one stops me," all he wanted, but it was his weakness screaming back at him, echoing into the void he had carved for himself. In that suffocating haze, with gnarled fingers and manic eyes, he found not victory, but the first tremor of inevitable ruin, and she, a figure of blood and ivory, waited without mercy. Her breath, ragged and precious, rattled inside her throat like the last echo of a dying violin, seamlessly carrying forward the silent defiance that had burned through her eyes moments before. He slammed her back into the witness chair with a brutal snap, the metal frame shuddering beneath the impact as if recoiling from the pure violence coursing through his veins. His other hand, nails jagged and sharp like splintered glass, clamped around the base of her neck, fingers digging into the vulnerable curve just above her spine. The skin split under his nails, beads of blood pooling and slipping down, creating a thin, trembling line that followed the curve of her neck like a cruelly drawn noose. She trembled once, a shiver passing through her as her lungs struggled for air, but her arms locked tighter around the file folder, the crumpled papers whispering a quiet, relentless resistance. Tears, sharp and clear, welled in her eyes, trembling at the edges like fragile pearls before slipping free and slicing across her cheeks. Each tear fell in slow motion, crashing onto the paper she held so fiercely, smearing ink and seeping into the fibers, leaving ghostly gray veins that spread like cracks through marble. Her knuckles turned white, tendons taut, as if she was holding not just evidence, but the entire weight of her identity, her truth, her refusal to yield. His face twisted above her, veins worming under his skin in grotesque relief, his lips curling into a sneer so vile it seemed to twist the very air around them. He leaned in, his breath a putrid fog of arrogance and rot, sliding across her ear with a hiss that scraped her soul raw. "No one will save you," he spat, each word a hammer blow against her already strained composure. "They all see you, they all watch, but not a single one dares to move. You're alone, always alone." His words dripped with a mocking sweetness, a serpentine lullaby meant to suffocate the last flicker of fight inside her. She squeezed her eyes shut, the muscles in her jaw twitching, lips parting as if tasting the words before they fell, each syllable a silent verdict against his hollow dominance. Her lips, cracked and pale, trembled as she inhaled, the sound like a blade drawn from a sheath. When she spoke, her voice was no louder than a breath, but it sliced through him with surgical precision. "You are weak," she whispered, each word deliberate and sharp, her voice a dagger pressed against the tender flesh of his pride. "Weak enough to need an audience to believe you are powerful." Her words shimmered in the air, a challenge dressed in silk but reinforced with steel, forcing him to recoil for a fleeting heartbeat before fury surged back to his eyes. A bead of blood, thin and dark, emerged at the edge of her neck, tracing a path downwards in an elegant, morbid arc that curled like a noose tightening around her spirit. The image burned into the collective gaze of the courtroom, an indelible mark of sacrifice and endurance. It was not a scream that escaped her lips, but a controlled exhale, her ribs expanding in shallow, jerky movements as she refused to surrender even a single full breath to him. His fingers twitched at her nape as if savoring every quiver of her oxygen-starved muscles, feeding on the sensation of her life teetering under his control. He pulled back slightly, eyes wide and wild, as if he could not comprehend the fortress standing behind her tears. His mouth cracked into a grin, jagged and cruel, an expression that didn't belong on a human face. "Look at you," he crooned, voice dipped in venom. "You think your silence is strength? You think you're above me? You're just a husk, a fragile doll waiting to shatter." The room remained still, the oxygen sucked out by the magnetism of his cruelty and her unwavering defiance. The blood smeared across her collarbone began to dry at the edges, a crusted border framing her unbroken line of sight. Her chest convulsed, her breaths slicing the heavy air like broken glass. She refused to avert her gaze, her eyes burning holes into his, dissecting the charade he draped over his crumbling authority. Her tears, far from betraying weakness, gleamed like tiny emblems of war, defying every command to break, to plead. Her nails dug deeper into the file, paper edges slicing her palm, red mixing with the ink in a quiet, violent signature of her will. The folder trembled, each tremor echoing the wild cadence of her heart, but it never left her grasp. He pressed his forehead to hers, his sweat smearing across her brow in a grotesque communion. "Beg me," he seethed again, his voice lower now, vibrating with a desperate hunger for submission. The lights above flickered, shadows dancing across their locked forms like dark specters encouraging his madness. Her eyelids fluttered, her lips parting not in a plea, but to draw the tiniest possible pocket of air into her starving lungs. In that moment, her breath became a battlefield, each molecule a soldier fighting against the invasion of his grip. A final tear slid down her jaw, paused at the tip of her chin, then dropped in slow, precise surrender onto the folder below. The droplet exploded into a dark bloom against the white page, a mark that mirrored the thin ribbon of blood now forming a grim necklace around her throat. The image was almost ceremonial, an involuntary coronation of her refusal to bend, her sacrifice captured in a single, devastating droplet. He laughed then, a dry, broken sound that scraped the walls and bounced into the silent throats of everyone watching. "Beautiful?" he rasped, his fingers spasming against her skin as if struck by an electric current. "So beautiful when they finally understand they're nothing." His words hung in the air like poisonous gas, thick and acidic, yet she swallowed them without flinching, transforming each syllable into an invisible armor. Her spine arched subtly, a slow menagerie rebellion against the chair's hard edge. Her eyes opened fully, black irises gleaming like obsidian under storm clouds. With each shuddering exhale, she seemed to grow larger, her presence pressing into his space, choking him in return. The blood on her neck glistened under the sterile lights, a silent chant to those who dared to witness but failed to act. He leaned back abruptly, suddenly aware of the tremor in his breath, the slip in his control that hissed at the edges of his sanity. Yet she remained, her essence uncrushed, her file clutched tighter, the papers crumpled beyond recognition but sanctified by her blood and tears. Her lips curved slightly, not a smile but an echo of scorn, a silent verdict delivered through a single defiant twitch. The V-shaped bloodline across her neck tightened, the noose image almost complete, but rather than a symbol of defeat, it crowned her as an unwilling martyr, a warrior clothed in agony and purpose. He tried to draw another breath to fuel his rage, but it came out shallow and fractured, each inhale a betrayal of his fading supremacy. His eyes flickered, darting between her unyielding stare and the blood-stained papers. Panic, sharp and raw, crept into his expression like a crack, spreading through ice. She had not pleaded. She had not surrendered. Every second she continued to exist, to breathe, twisted the knife deeper into his psyche. The room held its collective breath, an invisible thread binding every witness to the unfolding cataclysm. They watched as his grip faltered, as her composure remained a monolith against his crumbling foundation. She exhaled once more, a harsh, rattling gasp that roared in the silent arena, a testament that he could take her air but never her will. The crimson thread on her throat glowed like molten iron under a blacksmith's hammer, a brand of her unyielding spirit. In that final, shared breath, it was no longer her life on trial, but his sanity, his narrative of power dissolving with each staccato beat of her heart. The blood curled downward, kissing the folded edges of the file, seeping into its core, as if fusing her soul to the evidence she protected. And as the last tear joined the crimson river, her eyes closed, not in defeat, but as an act of sovereign defiance. A queen dismissing an unworthy intruder from her throne. She was beyond him, beyond the courtroom, beyond every eye that dared to watch but failed to rise. Her breath might falter, her pulse might stutter, but her spirit roared louder than any scream, an immortal echo through marble halls and trembling hearts. Her eyelids fluttered open like a blade unsheathing under moonlight, the faint shimmer of defiance lighting her pupils into two black flames. The blood still curled around her neck, each dried vein a testament to the torture she had endured, but now her gaze burned brighter than the crimson staining her collar. Her head tilted slightly, a subtle motion that spoke louder than any scream, her eyes fixing on the courtroom's trembling camera lens as though she were addressing an entire nation rather than a frozen room of silent spectators. The lens, cold and unblinking, mirrored her contempt, recording each heartbeat of her quiet revolution. The moment her stare locked into that digital eye, the entire universe seemed to contract into a single point, a vortex of rage and unwavering clarity. His breath stuttered in his chest, surprise cracking through his arrogance like lightning through rotted wood. He lowered his face close to hers, voice dropping into a guttural snarl. "What are you staring at? Beg? Get on your knees and beg me." The words dripped with an acidic desperation, claws of control slipping from his grasp with every tremor in his voice. But she didn't even flinch. Instead, her lips curved into a slow, razor-thin smile, a movement that seemed to carve the space between them into fragments. Her chin lifted, eyes gleaming with a disdain so sharp it could flay flesh from bone. The corner of her mouth twitched, a twitch that was both a slap and a declaration. "You still don't understand the stage you're performing on," she murmured, her tone smooth and cold, each syllable slicing through the heavy air like a scalpel. "You believe this room is your theater. You think these people are your audience, but you've been playing to the wrong crowd from the start." The words didn't rise above a hush, yet they thundered through his skull, dismantling his illusion brick by brick. His nostrils flared, his jaw ticking, rage boiling into his veins as if he could set her aflame just by glaring harder. A thin sheet of paper fluttered from her folder, drifting downward in lazy spirals, the stark black words glowing under the sterile lights as it landed on the polished floor. The letters read, "Internal Affairs Confidential," a revelation so sudden it sliced through the tense quiet like a guillotine. The gasps were immediate, a collective shiver crawling through the crowd, rising like a tidal wave of doubt and horror. Smartphones rose from trembling fingers, lenses zooming in, shutters clicking in feverish succession, flashes blinked like lightning, freezing the terror in his eyes for eternity. He snapped his head toward the audience, spittle flying from his twisted lips. "Stop recording. Put those damn phones down." His voice, once dripping with self-assured cruelty, now cracked with panic, thin and brittle as a dying branch. No one listened. The silence that answered him roared louder than any protest, a silent indictment that gnawed at his last shred of power. Each flash from a phone was a nail driven into the coffin of his vanishing dominance. Her eyes never wavered, twin spears of pitch-black scorn that pinned him to the spot more brutally than any chain. The blood around her throat glistened under the sporadic camera flashes, her silent figure transforming from victim to executioner in the public eye. The courtroom, once a cathedral of supposed justice, had become an arena where she stood tall above his writhing, shrieking futility. The subtle shake of her shoulders was not fear, but the tremor of an oncoming storm, her internal tide shifting from defense to open confrontation. He lunged forward again, fingers twitching in the air as if grasping for the last threads of a stage he no longer controlled. His face hovered inches from hers, sweat dripping into his collar. "They don't know you like I do," he hissed, voice desperate, a sour echo of his former swagger. She tilted her head, her smirk sharpening into a blade. The small, deliberate motion said everything words couldn't. She pitied him. She despised him, and above all, she had already won. Her glance shifted to the audience, her eyes sweeping over each petrified face, each camera lens now immortalizing his downfall. She didn't need to shout, didn't need to flail or rage. Her silence, punctuated only by the occasional twitch of blood down her collar, reverberated across the hall with deafening clarity. The mumbled gasps of the crowd turned into a trembling chorus of confusion and revelation, a growing wave that threatened to engulf the last illusion of his power. A bead of sweat trickled down his cheek, hanging on his jawline for a breathless moment before crashing to the floor. A quiet surrender mirrored in the twitch of his fingers. His pupils darted wildly, as though searching for an escape hatch that no longer existed, but she offered him none. Her eyes anchored him, a magnetic force field that stripped every layer of his false bravado, leaving nothing but a caged animal quivering before its final judgment. In that single, sustained stare, she shifted the axis of the battle. Her breath, once stolen and choked, had returned as a storm brewing silently in her chest. Her Her hands, once locked in a desperate hold on her evidence, now rested with a subtle poise, like a queen cradling the scepter of her inevitable justice. The paper on the floor screamed in silence, its bold letters like a flare shot into the sky, signaling to every hidden eye that the facade was over. The game was done. His voice, once a weapon, now reduced to a whimper, echoing against marble walls that no longer listened. He was no longer the predator, he was prey, paralyzed under her unwavering gaze. Every second stretched into an eternity, every heartbeat a countdown to the collapse of his empire built on intimidation and lies. She stood, eyes blazing, spine a monument to unyielding resolve, and as she watched him crumble, her pupils gleamed with the cold brilliance of a star that would not be snuffed out. Not by his hands, not by his threats, not by the cowardice of the crowd that dared only to watch. The electric silence that her gaze had commanded fractured in an instant when her lips parted, not in a gasp of surrender, but in a low, chilling laugh that trickled from her throat like smoke curling into a midnight sky. The sound, impossibly soft and sharp all at once, sliced through the charged air, freezing every flicker of movement, every gasp that trembled on the brink of escape. Blood still trickled from her neck, forming a dark necklace that gleamed under the cold lights, but her laughter rose above it all, an eerie hymn of defiance that made the walls shudder as if they too understood the gravity of her revolt. He jerked back as if struck by lightning, his fingers trembling against her skin, the grip slackening for a heartbeat as disbelief shattered across his face like a dropped mirror. The disbelief didn't last long. Fury roared back into his veins with a feral growl, and he surged forward again, his hand snapping tight around her throat, nails digging into fresh wounds, smearing red crescents across her pale flesh. And even as he squeezed harder, her laughter refused to die. It twisted in the air, echoing in the high arches of the courtroom, a dark melody that coiled around every ear and refused to be ignored. Her head tilted closer, their foreheads nearly touching, her eyes gleaming with a feral intelligence that scorched every shred of his crumbling dominance. "You just signed the death warrant for your career," she murmured, her voice steady despite the constriction of her throat, each word dripping with venomous clarity that could peel skin from bone. The words snaked into his ears, igniting a wildfire behind his eyes, his face contorting in a grotesque mask of confusion and dread. Before he could recoil, her hand moved, subtle and precise, fingers brushing against the small microphone pinned to her vest, a device so inconspicuous that it might have been overlooked in the madness of violence and blood. With a decisive flick of her thumb, she pressed the button. A sharp click reverberated beneath the surface of her laughter, and then the room erupted. The overhead speakers crackled to life, flooding the courtroom with his snarling, hate-soaked words, each syllable magnified into an inescapable storm that battered every corner of the hall. "Here, I am the law. You don't deserve to breathe. Beg me. No one will save you." His words, once whispered with the intimacy of a predator savoring his kill, now thundered across the marble floors, echoing off shocked faces and frozen jaws. The shift was instantaneous. Phones dropped, eyes bulged, hands shot up to cover gaping mouths. As the words boomed again and again, each repetition peeling away the illusion he had so carefully constructed, his hand, still locked on her throat, trembled violently, every tremor a silent admission of guilt echoing through the halls. He turned his head toward the audience, his eyes wild and glassy, a silent plea trapped behind the rabid snarl twisting his lips. But there would be no rescue, no sympathetic ears to muffle his downfall. The courtroom had become a coliseum, and the crowd was no longer passive. They were bloodthirsty witnesses, hungry for the collapse of the monster before them. Her laughter deepened, a sound rich with scorn and lethal amusement, seeping into the microphone and amplifying through the speakers until it rattled the very bones of the walls. It was the laugh of someone who had bled and still rose, of someone who had tasted the edge of death and turned it into a weapon sharper than any blade. Her breath hitched slightly from the pressure on her throat, but even the gasps felt like blades, every strained inhale echoing like a triumphant battle cry. Her eyes, locked on his, flickered with an unspoken promise. He would not leave this room whole. His mouth opened in a mute scream, spittle spraying across her cheek as he clawed for control that no longer existed. The crowd surged forward instinctively, phones once again lifted like torches in a witch hunt, recording every frantic twitch of his fingers, every spasm of his lips. "Stop! Turn it off!" he howled, voice cracking, splintering into pitiful fragments that crashed onto the cold, indifferent floor. But his pleas only fed the inferno. Her laughter swelled in response, filling every hidden crevice of the room, reverberating off the walls like the final note of a requiem. She leaned closer, her lips grazing the shell of his ear, breath warm and laced with blood. "Everyone hears you now," she whispered, the softness of her tone a deadly contrast to the hurricane exploding around them. "No one stops me. You stopped yourself." Her words dripped like acid, corroding the last scaffolds of his pride, his shoulders shaking as if he were a marionette being cut from its strings. His knees buckled, and for a split second he seemed to collapse inward, a black hole swallowing his arrogance, his cruelty, his illusions of omnipotence. Above them, the feedback from the speakers screeched like a banshee, momentarily drowning in the cacophony of her laughter and his strangled sobs. The cameras recorded every nuance, every flicker of terror, every shade of humiliation painting his face. The spectators, once silent, now roared in a rising tide of collective vindication, their shouts punctuating the symphony of his disgrace. She remained the eye of this storm, her laughter tapering into a cruel smile that etched itself into the consciousness of everyone present. With each passing second, the courtroom transformed into a living testament to his unraveling, a stage where his sins played on loop, each word a lash cracking across his psyche. Her presence loomed larger, unshaken, her silhouette defined by the crimson trail around her throat and the incandescent glow of righteous fury burning in her eyes. She had not only reclaimed her breath, she had stolen his voice, turned it against him, amplified it into a weapon that left no refuge, no shadow deep enough to hide. And as his nails finally slipped from her skin, leaving streaks of blood that glimmered under the harsh lights, she stood, unwavering, the microphone still hot in her palm. His shoulders sagged, his mouth gaping open in a silent, endless wail, the last sound of a man who realized, too late, that the monster he built had devoured him first. Her chest rose and fell in quiet, sovereign rhythm, each breath a silent vow that his reign had ended, that his story would echo not as a triumph, but as an eternal warning, carved into marble and memory alike. The echo of his silent wail still hung in the air when his head snapped from side to side, pupils dilated, sweat slicking his forehead into a grotesque mirror of desperation. His gaze darted frantically across the courtroom, as if searching for a single sympathetic eye, a single loyal face, but he found only an endless sea of raised phones, flashes blinking like electric stars in a merciless night. Each lens was a dagger, each flash a verdict, illuminating every ugly contour of his unraveling. His breath fractured into jagged shards, chest rising and falling in spastic bursts as his kingdom of intimidation crumbled grain by grain under the floodlights of truth. She moved with unearthly calm, each step deliberate, an echo of the storm she had just unleashed. Her fingers curled around the edges of a card, its sharp corners biting into her palm like a lover's betrayal. Without warning, she thrust it forward, slamming it against his cheek with a smack that reverberated into every shuddering corner of the hall. The badge glinted under the lights. Internal Affairs Director. The words might as well have been molten iron, searing into his flesh, burning away the last illusion of his supremacy. His face twisted into a grotesque mask of shock and animal rage. Spittle sprayed from his snarling lips as he lunged forward, fingers clawing for the badge, as if it were his final anchor to a world slipping beyond his grasp. "You lied to me! You tricked me!" he howled, voice shredding itself into hysterical fragments that scuttled across the floor like broken glass. His hands flailed, a desperate ballet of denial and fury, but her movements were faster, cleaner, slicing through his chaos with surgical precision. She tilted her head slightly, eyes gleaming with merciless serenity, her voice low and lethal. "This isn't your court. This is the court of truth." Her words slammed into him harder than any physical blow, his fingers freezing mid-air as if bound by invisible chains. He roared and swung a hand toward her face in a wild, primal arc, fingers splayed to rake across her skin. But before the strike could land, her arm shot up like a guillotine, capturing his wrist in an iron grip. The motion was so swift it seemed to split the air itself, her muscles coiling with quiet violence. With a single fluid twist, she redirected his momentum, dragging his arm downward in a cruel spiral that ended when his elbow slammed against the edge of the wooden table. A wet, sharp crack echoed out, followed by a geyser of blood erupting from his elbow joint, painting the wood in a sudden, savage bloom of red. His mouth gaped in a soundless scream, knees buckling as pain rippled through his nervous system like wildfire. His fingers flexed, twitching in spasms of raw agony as he tried to comprehend the betrayal of his own body. She watched him with a chilling stillness, her breath steady, her eyes gleaming with an inner light that outshone every flash in the room. The badge still glimmered in her other hand, an unyielding symbol of the authority he had mocked and underestimated. Every drop of blood that splattered onto her pristine vest was a crown jewel in her quiet conquest, each stain a mark of his irreversible downfall. The crowd, once frozen in horrified awe, began to murmur, their voices low but growing, an undercurrent of collective realization and vengeance. The camera lenses zeroed in on the raw brutality of his collapse, on her poised dominance, on the unstoppable tide of justice crashing through every barrier he had erected. He stumbled backward, cradling his ruined arm against his chest, eyes wide and unseeing, lips babbling incoherent fragments that dissolved into saliva at the edges. She stepped forward, closing the distance in a heartbeat, her shadow swallowing his form in a silent, final eclipse. Her gaze burned into his, a scorching interrogation that stripped him bare before the entire world. He could not look away, could not breathe without her permission, could not exist without her sanction. Each step she took was a funeral drumbeat, echoing across his hollow throne, and as the blood continued to pour from his elbow, staining the floor in a spreading pool of crimson confession, it was clear. The crack in his power had become a chasm, too wide, too deep to ever cross again. The crimson pool beneath him still shimmered when her fingers coiled around his injured arm, her grip steady as a vice, her eyes locked onto his like a predator savoring the precise moment before the final strike. His breath hitched in short, broken spasms, his mouth gaping in a grotesque mimicry of protest. She inhaled slowly, each breath an invocation of unstoppable force, her presence expanding like a silent avalanche crashing through his last defense. Her hand began to twist, the motion deliberate and terrifyingly slow, each millimeter a declaration of her absolute dominion. The crack of bone came next, sharp and final, slicing through the thick air like a blade snapping a taut wire. His scream split the courtroom, high-pitched and feral, echoing in the vaulted ceilings and lodging into the marrow of every onlooker. His eyes bulged, veins webbing across his forehead in frantic protest, as if trying to claw free from beneath his own skin. He spat words that tangled into a garbled cry, "You won't! You don't dare!" But his defiance was already dissolving, his voice trailing into a shrill whimper even before the final syllable had fully left his lips. She leaned closer, her face composed, almost serene, like a judge passing sentence from an unassailable throne. "You're wrong," she murmured, her voice calm and icy, every word carrying the crushing weight of undeniable truth. "I dare everything for the truth." The sentence landed like a steel gauntlet, crushing the fragile shards of his ego beyond recognition. Her wrist rotated further, and his elbow joint betrayed him completely. Another sickening snap cascading into a wave of nauseated gasps from the audience. His knees finally collapsed, sending him crashing to the floor in a boneless heap. His good hand shot out in a last, desperate lunge toward the folder that still gleamed in the sterile light, pages now splattered with blood like a war flag soaked in sacrifice. His fingers grazed the edge for a fleeting moment, the whisper of hope flickering in his pupils, but she moved faster than thought itself. Her foot slammed into his chest, her heel digging into the fabric and muscle, driving him flat against the floor with a brutal finality that reverberated through every bone. He wheezed, the sound thin and brittle, his entire frame convulsing under the unbearable pressure. His fingers fluttered, scratching uselessly at the floor, a pathetic mimicry of flight from a bird whose wings had long since been torn away. Her silhouette loomed above him, sharp and immovable, the incarnation of every verdict he had once evaded, now concentrated into a single, unrelenting force. She slowly lowered herself to his level, one knee pressing into the ground with regal precision, her breath a whisper against his trembling ear. "You thought you were choking me," she breathed, her voice low and venomous, each syllable a dagger driving deeper into the remains of his courage. "But you've only ever been choking yourself." Her words sank into him like poison, corroding his last illusions and leaving nothing but raw, exposed fear. His mouth opened in a shuddering attempt to respond, but only a strangled gurgle escaped, bubbling through spit and blood, the final echo of a man whose power had been stripped down to marrow. Around them, the crowd stood frozen, eyes wide and unblinking, as if each soul had been shackled to the floor by the gravity of her revelation. The phones captured every tremor, every fractured gasp, every spasm of his shattered arm. In this microcosm of violence and justice, she had inverted the roles, recast the predator as prey, woven a noose invisible to all but those who dared to truly see. Each second stretched, a deliberate slow-gravity descent into the abyss he had crafted for others but never envisioned for himself. Her eyes never wavered, cold and brilliant as obsidian, their reflection the final judgment that no jury could overturn. She straightened slightly, her gaze sweeping down his prone form, her lips curling into a ghost of a smile, not of joy, but of grim, irrevocable truth. As the light flickered against the blood now smearing his uniform, it revealed the outline of the noose she had so poetically described. An execution not by rope, but by the merciless strangulation of his arrogance and cowardice. In that suffocating moment, with cameras humming like an audience of silent jurors, it was clear that his reign had ended not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, suffocating spiral of his hubris. He had thought he could command fear with his hands. Instead, he had become the architect of his hanging, each twitch of her wrist tightening a rope he never saw until it was too late. And she, radiant in her blood-streaked white, knelt above him as the living embodiment of the justice he had spent his life trying to smother, her every breath a reminder that some spirits were too powerful to ever truly silence. The moment her words about the invisible noose had dissolved into the electrified silence, she rose with a grace that seemed almost unnatural, like a phoenix ascending from the ashes of her blood. Her white suit, now marred by jagged streaks of red, clung to her form like a war banner, every stain a chapter of silent defiance that had led to this precise, preordained moment. The crowd's collective breath hung in the air, suspended, as if the entire universe leaned forward to witness what would come next. She stood tall, her spine a perfect line of authority, her chin tilted upward in a stance that dared the world to look away. The lights overhead ignited the gleam in her eyes, transforming them into twin beacons of judgment and revelation. Slowly, she lifted her hand, fingers slick with his blood and her own, and pulled from her inner pocket a badge that shimmered like a blade under moonlight. With a decisive motion, she raised it above her head, the golden seal catching every trembling flash from the countless cameras now trained on her. The room inhaled, as one entity, a wave of anticipation crashing in absolute silence. Her voice rang out, sharp and clear, slicing through the stagnant fear that had paralyzed every soul in that courtroom. "Director of Internal Affairs, wife of the chief of police, and today I stand before you as the witness." Each title fell like a hammer against an anvil, each syllable striking the fragile shell of his delusions until it shattered beyond repair. Her declaration ricocheted through the cavernous room, a seismic shock wave that peeled back every layer of deceit he had worn like armor. His scream tore free, raw and animalistic, a desperate sound that splashed against marble walls and returned to him, echoing his downfall. "No, I didn't know. You tricked me." His face contorted into a grotesque mask of horror and betrayal, eyes bulging, veins crawling up his temples like panicked serpents. He stumbled backward, fingers clawing at the air as if he could grasp reality and force it to reverse. But there was no retreat, no shelter, only the unrelenting truth, now glaring down at him through the unwavering gaze of the woman he had tried to crush. She stepped forward, her heels striking the floor like gunshots, each step a decree of finality. Her smile, cold and glacial, spread across her lips with the elegance of a blade sliding into flesh. "Of course you didn't know," she said, her voice calm, almost pitying, each word dipped in acid and honey alike. "You never know, do you? You're always too busy bathing in your own arrogance to see the storm crawling up your spine." The audience, once an ocean of stunned faces, now erupted into a thunderous crescendo of gasps and exclamations. The entire room quivered under the weight of her revelation, a living organism convulsing as its heartbeat finally aligned with the rhythm of truth. The guards stationed at the door jolted into action, boots pounding the floor in a synchronized rush as they advanced, eyes locked on the trembling husk of the man who once believed himself untouchable. He spun toward them, arms flailing in a grotesque dance of denial, his mouth a chasm of wordless pleas. But the guards did not hesitate. Their boots cut through the air like scythes in a harvest of power and pride, slicing away his last illusions of command. Camera zoomed closer, lenses capturing every twitch of his shredded dignity, every tremor that crawled across his pale, blood-smeared skin. The crowd's roar grew, a tidal wave of vindication that rose and crashed in a single unstoppable moment. Her eyes, cold and infinite, tracked every movement, her badge still gleaming in her hand like a divine verdict. She tilted her head slightly, as if observing a pitiful insect flailing beneath a magnifying glass, her expression unchanging save for the thin line of satisfaction curving at the edge of her lips. Every breath she drew seemed to expand her aura, consuming the space around her, until she stood not just as a woman, but as an embodiment of unassailable justice. And as the guards finally closed in, as they seized him and began to drag his twitching form across the polished floor, her voice cut through the chaos one final time, a final nail hammered into the coffin of his reign. "This was never your stage," she declared, her words slicing through the din with surgical precision. "This was the stage of truth, and you were never its master, only its prey." In that instant, the courtroom became a cathedral of retribution, the echoes of her declaration ringing like church bells in every corner, imprinting themselves into the marrow of every witness. The power he had so desperately clung to had not merely cracked, it had crumbled into dust, ground beneath the heel of a woman who refused to kneel. The last echoes of her revelation still reverberated through the courtroom like a war drum when he lunged forward in one final, pathetic grasp at dominance. His fingers clawed at her sleeve, tearing through the fabric with a wild, frantic strength born of pure desperation. The sleeve split open, revealing a jagged, pale scar etched across her forearm, a silent testament to past violence, a battle wound still whispering its story in the hush of fluorescent light. His eyes flickered downward, momentarily catching on the old wound, confusion and terror swirling behind his pupils, as if he had glimpsed a ghost rising from his future. She looked down at the scar, her lips curling into a thin, cold smile that glowed with quiet triumph. "This," she said, her voice a lethal hush that sliced between them like a blade, "this is a souvenir from another coward like you." Her words fell like stones into an abyss, each syllable punctuating the final crumbling of his illusions. The crowd held its collective breath. The courtroom transformed into an arena of savage judgment, every eye locked on the predator now reduced to a trembling shell. Before he could retreat or gather another breath of defiance, two guards surged forward, their boots thunderous against the marble floor. One seized him by the hair, yanking his head back with a brutal, mechanical precision that sent a shriek tearing through his throat. The other twisted his uninjured arm behind his back, snapping a metal cuff around his wrist with a sound sharp enough to slice through the tense silence. He writhed like a snared animal, spittle flying, his legs kicking helplessly against the polished floor as they dragged him downward, his dignity unraveling with every inch. She stood above him, her expression unflinching, her gaze descending on him like an executioner's final verdict. Slowly, she bent forward, her hair falling in a dark cascade that framed her face in a halo of authority and cold resolution. Her voice, low and thunderous despite its softness, coiled around him with the finality of a noose. "You always thought no one could stop you," she whispered, each word echoing in his hollowed chest. "Stopped you. Here. Now." His eyes shot open, pupils dilated in raw horror, his mouth gaping in a desperate plea that collapsed into incoherent sobs. "No, no, please, don't stream this. I'm begging you." The words tumbled from his lips like sewage, each syllable a stain on the air, a final testament to the rotting foundation of his power. But the cameras kept rolling, their red lights glaring down like the eyes of vengeful gods. The audience remained unmoved, transfixed by the pure, unfiltered spectacle of his downfall. Every twitch of his body, every strangled scream, every shudder of his spine was etched into the public consciousness forever. As the guards forced him to his knees, his head wrenched back by a brutal fistful of hair, he whimpered and trembled, his uniform now a parody of authority, drenched in sweat, tears, and the crimson smudges of his blood. His fingers scrabbled uselessly against the floor, nails scraping shallow grooves in a futile attempt to cling to the last shreds of his illusion. Above him she remained unyielding, her silhouette towering and immutable, the living embodiment of consequence delivered with surgical precision. The guards began to drag him across the floor, his knees squealing against the cold surface, each scrape a note in the symphony of his humiliation. His mouth flapped open and closed, ragged sobs shredding his vocal cords, the last echoes of a tyrant reduced to nothing but a pitiful animal awaiting slaughter. Cameras followed every second, their lenses devouring his disgrace and feeding it back into the world in an endless loop of public execution. She watched, her breath even and her stance unwavering, as if the spectacle before her were not a man being dragged away, but the final act of a cleansing ritual, a necessary purge of a rot that had festered for far too long. Her eyes met his one last time, and in that fleeting glance he saw no mercy, no empathy, no semblance of the humanity he had so carelessly discarded in his reign of terror. Only the cold, relentless judgment of a woman who had decided beyond question to end him. His final shriek echoed one last time against the marble walls, dissolving into a pathetic whimper swallowed by the roar of justice. And as the guards carried him beyond the threshold of power he had once ruled, the room erupted not with applause, but with the electric silent weight of retribution fulfilled, a collective inhalation of liberation, a breath finally reclaimed from the chokehold of his tyranny. As his last whimper evaporated into the electrified silence, the courtroom lights shifted with a mechanical hum, illuminating the massive screen that loomed above the judge's bench like a divine eye preparing to pass eternal judgment. A cold click cut the air, and the screen flickered to life, its brightness slicing through the tension-heavy shadows. At first, there was only static, a visual breath that held the audience in a suffocating grip. Then, the footage began. He appeared on screen, sweat-soaked, eyes glassy with drunken arrogance, a whiskey bottle dangling from his hand like a grotesque scepter of his self-made kingdom, his voice slurred but sharp enough to pierce the marrow of every spectator's spine. "I bought this entire city," he bellowed, spit flying in greasy arcs under the dim, flickering lights of a backroom bar. I own every badge, every judge, every sorry excuse for a hero. They all bend to me. He threw his head back in a wild, hyena-like laugh that echoed from the speakers, a hollow, metallic sound that sliced into the collective conscience of the room like a rusty blade. Below the screen, he convulsed in his restraints, his eyes bulging as if they might burst from their sockets. He jerked his legs violently, his heels cracking against the floor, the sound harsh and pitiful. His feet found the base of a nearby chair, and in a pathetic, feral thrash, he kicked it over, the metal legs clanging against marble with a shriek of defeat. His wrists twisted against the cuffs, flesh tearing in his futile struggle to escape not the metal, but the inescapable truth, now projected larger than life above him. She stepped forward then, her movements slow, sovereign, the deliberate cadence of a monarch savoring the final strike against a traitor. Her voice, when it came, slid into the room like a cold blade under the ribs. This, she declared, her tone smooth and venom-laced, is you, unedited, uncut, the true face behind your hollow threats. The words fell into the stunned hush like molten iron into water, the hiss of revelation crashing through the crowd's fragile illusion. He howled, a ragged animal scream that rattled the light fixtures, his knees buckling so hard they threatened to snap, his face turned a sickly shade of gray, sweat and snot streaking down his cheeks in glistening rivers of despair. He rocked back and forth, his eyes locked on the screen as if he could will it to shatter, to evaporate along with his last remnants of power. But the video played on relentlessly, showcasing him bragging about bribes, assaults, and a city strangled under his invisible fist. She tilted her head, eyes narrowing into a scalpel's edge as she watched him writhe beneath the weight of his confession. Her lips curled into a faint smile, a blade of satisfaction slicing across her features. Every victim, she said, her voice thick with a cold, righteous finality, is watching you beg right now. Her words reverberated off the marble, slamming into his chest like a battering ram, each syllable a hammer driving the nails into the coffin of his public persona. As if guided by an unseen conductor, members of the audience began to rise, one by one. The sound of their shoes against the floor resonated like the slow tolling of a funeral bell. They faced him, their eyes void of pity, hands rising in a slow, unified applause. The sound began as a whisper, a ripple, then grew into a tidal wave of slow, deliberate claps that crashed into the walls, echoing with the unstoppable gravity of an executioner's drum. Each clap was a verdict, each pause between beats a silence more deafening than any scream. He shrieked again, high and broken, his body contorting like a marionette severed from its strings, his head thrashed side to side, hair matted and plastered to his forehead, mouth gaping in a wordless plea that no longer had an audience willing to hear. He banged his feet against the floor, each thud a pathetic echo of a power that had disintegrated beyond recognition. Above him, the video looped, each drunken boast repeated in an unrelenting cycle of self-destruction. The projection, searingly bright, branded his crimes into the eyes and hearts of everyone watching. There would be no coming back, no carefully crafted statements, no legal smokescreens to fog the memory of his confession. It was a final, irreversible exposure, a striptease of his soul that left him naked before a merciless sea of judgment. She watched the slow applause build into an avalanche, her breathing calm, her figure a monument to justice incarnate. Each flicker of the screen, each clap, each tortured wriggle of his body cemented her triumph, transforming her from a victim into the very embodiment of retribution. Her eyes never left him, her gaze the final blade pressing against his throat, reminding him that the gods he thought he controlled had turned away, leaving him to face only the cruel mercy of the truth. In that final, unending moment, the courtroom became an altar, the applause a hymn, the screen a stained glass window depicting the fall of a tyrant. And he, shackled and screaming beneath the gaze of 1,000 unblinking witnesses, was nothing more than a grotesque offering to a justice long denied but never forgotten. The echoes of slow, deliberate applause still lingered in the charged air when she moved forward, her steps measured and heavy with the finality of a closing tomb. Her eyes remained locked on him, burning through his shredded facade with a quiet, unflinching authority that weighed more than any gavel ever could. She stopped in front of him, her silhouette etched in the harsh lights, every line of her figure a living testament to triumph forged in blood and fire. He had collapsed fully now, his knees digging into the polished floor, his shoulders heaving with each labored sob. His forehead almost touched the ground, his breath coming out in ragged, desperate hiccups, each exhale a mournful confession of his extinguished reign. The once imposing uniform now sagged around him like a costume on a broken doll, its seams soaked with sweat, spit, and defeat. The metal cuffs clinked softly as his arms trembled, the only sound in a room otherwise frozen in sacred silence. Her gaze drifted downward to the tarnished badge pinned to his chest, that cheap metal icon he once paraded as his divine right to judge and destroy lives. With a deliberate, almost reverent motion, she leaned down, her fingers sliding beneath the emblem, her grip firm as she ripped it free in one sharp pull. The sound was small, a metallic snap that nonetheless thundered through the cavernous space like a gunshot. She lifted it slowly, examining it as though it were a dead insect pinned under glass. Then, with a flick of her wrist so precise it felt ceremonial, she let the badge fall. It clattered against the marble, landing at his knees, the sharp echo a final punctuation mark on his obliterated legacy. His head lifted fractionally, eyes swollen and raw, his mouth slack with grief that no longer had words. A broken sob clawed its way out of his throat, harsh and dry, echoing through the room like a dying animal's final cry. His hands twitched forward, trembling fingers inching toward the fallen badge as if he might cradle it, attach it, breathe life back into the corpse of his authority. But the distance was an abyss, the symbol now as unreachable as redemption itself. She watched him, her expression an exquisite mask of cold serenity. Then she spoke, her voice neither loud nor forceful, yet heavy enough to anchor every heartbeat in the room. "Your silence today," she said, each syllable enunciated like a vow spoken over a grave, "is justice for every scream you silenced, for every plea you crushed beneath your arrogance." The words moved through him like a poison, his spine curving forward even deeper, his forehead pressing fully to the floor now, as if in an instinctive, pitiful bow to the force that had finally unmade him. Around them, the spectators remained hushed, as though even breath would desecrate the sacred weight of this reckoning. Cameras focused, lenses zoomed, each digital eye hungry to capture the raw, irreversible transformation of a tyrant into a sobbing husk. The collective hush transformed the courtroom into a cathedral, each heartbeat a silent hymn of witness to this ultimate reversal of power. The only sound was the echo of his choked cries, a dirge more potent than any orchestrated requiem. She stood still, unyielding as a marble statue, her chin raised just slightly, her eyes locked not on the man quivering below her, but on the horizon beyond this moment, a future reborn in the ashes of his defeat. Her breathing remained even, her chest rising and falling with the measured grace of someone who had mastered both war and peace within her skin. The room held her in reverent thrall, every mind seared with the image of her poised dominance and his crumpled collapse. Then, with the mechanical whir, the screen above them came alive again. This time, no footage played. Instead, a single line of text appeared in stark white against an infinite black void. "No one stops me until today." The letters glowed with an eerie, righteous finality, as though carved directly from the marrow of every victim he had ever trampled. Each word seared into the retinas of those present, a brand they would carry long after they left the sterile chill of this courtroom. His breath hitched and he let out a strangled moan as he read the words, his fingers curling into claws against the marble, nails splintering in desperate denial. but the message loomed above him, immutable, inescapable, echoing the mantra he had once wielded as a weapon, now turned into the iron gallows of his own destruction. The cameras panned in, catching every twitch, every tear, every tremor of his unraveling spirit. She remained unmoved, her expression unreadable, her silence an unbreakable verdict more crushing than any scream. And, as the cameras continued to record, as the final sobs echoed into the cold marble hall, the air seemed to thicken, with a reverence so potent it bordered on the divine. The world watched, transfixed, as the Titan fell, not in a blaze of glory, but in the quiet, devastating collapse of his own making. In that solemn moment, justice was not shouted, not declared with grandiose gestures or empty slogans. It stood there, steady and absolute, in her silence, in the badge at his knees, in the text above that whispered the last word he would ever own. And for the first time in his life, his silence finally spoke the truth he had buried for so long. He was stopped. Here, now, forever. His final sob still clung to the walls, echoing like a ghost, unwilling to be exorcised, when his knees buckled entirely beneath him. His forehead dropped to the polished floor, the cold marble kissing his sweat-soaked skin in a cruel mockery of comfort. He shook violently, shoulders convulsing as though an invisible hand were wringing the last drops of dignity from his bones. His chest heaved with erratic desperation, every gasp slicing through his throat like shards of broken glass. The camera zoomed in mercilessly, capturing every tremor, every spasm, every quivering breath as he dissolved before the world's unblinking eye. Slowly, like a creature dragged from the depths of a nightmare, he pushed himself back onto his knees. His palms slapped the floor in frantic intervals, each thud a pathetic metronome to his disintegration. Tears spilled down his bruised, mottled face in thick, glistening rivulets, carving rivers of shame that gleamed beneath the harsh courtroom lights. His mouth hung open, jaws slack, a grotesque frame for the guttural wail that erupted from somewhere deep in his hollowed chest. "Please! I was forced! I was tricked!" he shrieked, his voice raw and brittle, a razor slicing through the heavy silence and falling in useless fragments at her feet. The words seemed to carry no weight, bouncing off her as if she were a statue carved from vengeance itself. His plea stank of cowardice, every syllable a festering wound oozing pus instead of sincerity. His hands rose, clawing at the empty air, fingers curled like a dying spider, grasping at the last vestiges of a web that had long since turned to ash. She stood unmoving, her silhouette a monolith against the shifting chaos of his collapse. Her eyes, still and merciless, glinted under the flickering light, reflecting no warmth, no pity, only a deep, bottomless knowing. Her breath was even, her chest rising and falling with the measured certainty of a tide that refuses to retreat. Each step she took toward him sounded like a gavel's final strike, echoing in the hollow caverns of his fractured psyche. He watched her advance with the helpless awe of prey, watching the slow approach of the predator's jaws. His eyes rolled frantically, tears mixing with snot and blood, creating a grotesque mask of human ruin. His mouth quivered, words stumbling from his lips in cracked, incoherent fragments. He lunged forward, arms outstretched, fingers trembling so violently they seemed on the verge of shattering. His palms landed on her shoes, smearing the polished leather with sweat and grime, as if he were grasping at a lifeline that had already been cut. She looked down, her expression unchanging, her gaze colder than any steel blade. Slowly, methodically, she bent down, her movements precise and deliberate, her fingers extending toward his quivering hands. For a moment his face lit up with a flicker of hope, his lips parting as though he might sob a thank you. But her touch was not a bomb, it was a scalpel. With chilling gentleness, she peeled his fingers from her shoes, one by one, each disconnection a silent verdict, a whispered reminder of every life he had snatched away without remorse. When his last finger slipped free, she straightened, letting his hands fall to the floor with a soft, hollow slap. He whimpered, his body folding inward like a dying flower under frost, his forehead once again crashing to the marble in a final, pitiful bow. Her voice cut the air next, smooth and venomous, each word sculpted from an unwavering certainty that stripped him down to marrow. "You chose your cruelty," she said, her tone as cold and absolute as a guillotine's fall. "No one forced your hand. You wielded it because you relished the power, fear, the surrender. You built your empire on stolen breasts, on suffocated voices. You have forfeited the right to mercy." He gasped at her words as if they had punctured his lungs, his chest hitching violently in a futile attempt to reclaim air that would never absolve him. He curled closer to her feet, forehead grinding against the floor, his hands now pawing at the marble, as if he might dig a grave to crawl into and escape her gaze. His sobs grew wetter, messier, each sound a discordant symphony of shattered illusions and primitive terror. The cameras captured every second, immortalizing the complete unraveling of the man who had once declared himself untouchable. She stood over him, her shoulders set like the ramparts of a fortress, her eyes narrowed into slits of controlled fire. Her silence in that moment roared louder than his screams, vibrating through the courtroom, through the cameras, through every witness who dared to breathe. She needed no further words. Her mere presence was an indictment, a closing argument carved from flesh and spirit. He lifted his head again, eyes bloodshot and unfocused, spit bubbling at the corners of his lips. "Please," he rasped, the word barely audible, like the final spark of a candle snuffed by an indifferent wind. He stretched his hand again, palm open in one last pathetic plea for absolution that would never come. She didn't move, didn't blink. His hand hovered there, trembling in the void between them, a dying star flickering against the infinite expanse of her unyielding judgment. At last, the final realization seemed to dawn in his eyes, the spark of hope extinguished as if swallowed by a black hole. His arm dropped to his side, limp and lifeless, his shoulders collapsing inward. He began to rock slowly, a hypnotic, mindless motion, his forehead thudding softly against the floor in rhythmic surrender. His voice cracked into a thin, keening whine, the sound of a man who had finally met the bottom of his abyss. She watched without pity, each breath a measured promise that she would not flinch, not now, not ever. She had already taken back every scream he had ever silenced, every plea he had ignored, and she had woven them into the quiet armor she now wore. In his final groveling, he had become not a man, but a vessel for every cry he had buried. And as he lay trembling beneath her, reduced to a quivering echo of former threats, she stood tall, unwavering, a monument to justice that would not be moved by tears, nor soothed by apologies too late to matter. Her eyes stayed locked on him, that quivering shell of arrogance and cowardice, even as his sobs rattled against the marble floor like a dying animal's final heartbeat. With slow, deliberate precision, she shifted her gaze downward, where the badge he once wore lay discarded among the sweat and tears pooling beneath him. The courtroom lights caught the metal edge, a cold gleam that flickered across her eyes like a silent promise of retribution. She stooped gracefully, fingers curling around the badge with a gentleness that felt almost mocking, as if she were cradling something delicate yet utterly meaningless. She turned it in her hand, letting the harsh, fluorescent light crawl across its surface, revealing every nick and scratch, every lie it had shielded, every abuse it had sanctioned. The polished gold plating now looked dull, a gaudy disguise for the rot it had hidden. Her thumb traced the engraved letters slowly, not with reverence, but with a clinical curiosity, as if dissecting the anatomy of a parasite. He raised his head fractionally, eyes catching the badge in her grip. For a fleeting moment, a flicker of something primal, perhaps hope, perhaps denial, lit behind his swollen pupils. His lips parted in a dry, rattling breath, and his hand twitched upward as though reaching for a phantom limb. But before he could crawl any closer, she took a single step forward, her figure eclipsing him in a shadow that felt heavier than iron. Without a word, she lifted the badge, letting it hover above his forehead. The cold metal seemed to vibrate between them, an unspoken sentence drawn taut in the sterile air. Then, with a slow, merciless press, she brought it down against his skin. The metal hissed faintly as it touched his forehead, leaving a harsh, burning imprint. His entire body jolted, a strangled yelp bursting from his throat, echoing around around the courtroom like a blade scraping against bone. The badge left a raw, angry red mark on his skin, an ugly brand that mocked every pretense of honor he had once claimed to hold. She leaned in slightly, her eyes narrowing to shards of obsidian. "Your power," she whispered, her voice a frozen gust that sliced straight through him, "was always just an empty piece of metal." Her words sank into him like poisoned needles, his body shuddering violently as he clutched at his head, his fingers trembling and clawing uselessly at the fresh wound. The badge now bore his sweat and the smear of his broken pride, a living testament to the farce he had constructed and worshipped. Then, without hesitation, she drew her arm back and flung the badge down. It slammed into the marble with a sharp, cracking report that shot through the room like a gunshot. The sound reverberated in the skull of every spectator, a final, irrevocable severance of the illusion he had cloaked himself in for so long. The badge skidded once, then settled in a small pool of his tears, its glint now no brighter than a shard of shattered glass. A gasp swept through the courtroom, the collective inhalation of an audience that had witnessed the symbolic execution of a man's fabricated identity. His head snapped back in shock, eyes rolling wildly before locking on the discarded badge. He let out a sound that was neither a word nor a cry, but something primal and animalistic, a deep, gurgling wail that vibrated in his chest like a death knell. He crawled forward, shoulders hitching, each movement jerky and pathetic, his fingers reaching for the symbol that could no longer save him. As he clutched at his forehead, the angry red mark glowed under the lights, a grotesque crown of shame that would never fade. His voice cracked and splintered as he moaned, a guttural string of nonsense syllables, his breath hitching in shallow, panicked spasms. Every inch he moved forward only emphasized his new reality, no longer a figure of authority but a disgraced relic, groveling before the embodiment of the justice he had mocked. She straightened, her shoulders squared, the cool confidence radiating from her like a silent war drum. Her eyes flickered downward, sweeping across the badge lying lifeless at his knees. "You built your kingdom on a hollow symbol," she declared, each word sharp and unyielding, slicing through the air with the precision of a scalpel. "Now it lies where it belongs, beneath you, broken and impotent." Her voice carried no pity, no hesitation, only the resolute echo of a verdict that no jury could contest. The finality of her words wrapped around him like a shroud, his wails climbing higher, echoing against the walls in a desperate symphony of regret and terror. His fingers finally met the badge, shaking violently as they closed around the cold metal. But there was no salvation in its touch, no power waiting to be reclaimed, only a biting coldness that mirrored the void now yawning within him. He pressed it to his chest, sobbing into its jagged edge, the red mark on his forehead searing into every camera, every eye, every mind that bore witness. She remained still, her expression carved from stone, the quiet aftershock of her sentence humming in the tense silence. Every spectator felt the room constrict, the oxygen thick and metallic, each breath dragging against the weight of the moment. The badge had fallen, the empire had crumbled, and in that instant he was no more than a husk, a trembling specter of everything he had once pretended to be. The echo of his sobs still hung in the suffocating air when she turned with the fluidity of a predator scenting its final kill. Her fingers closed around the thick file resting on the edge of the judge's bench, a dossier so heavy it seemed to sag under the weight of lives it carried within. With a single, sharp motion, she flipped it open, and the photos inside caught the courtroom lights like shards of broken mirrors. Her eyes never left him, their dark intensity boring through the fragile scaffolding of his sanity as she approached the witness stand turned execution stage. He lifted his head, the red brand on his forehead now a crown of shame, eyes wide and glassy with animal terror, his fingers curled into claws against the marble, nails nails scraping thin lines into the surface as he dragged himself backward, trying to put distance between his trembling frame and the specter of his history. But she advanced with methodical grace, each step punctuated by the rhythmic flutter of paper sliding free from the dossier. The first photograph landed on the table with a sharp slap, the sound of gunshot in the tomb-like hush. The image was stark, brutal. A young boy, eyes wide with silent screams, purple bruises blooming across his neck like poisonous flowers. His mouth was open mid-cry, a snapshot of agony immortalized in glossy ink. The man's chest convulsed, his breath catching in violent staccato bursts, each inhale a knife plunging deeper into the cavity of his denial. His pupils twitched, his head jerking from side to side, as though he could physically shake free from the image now burning itself onto the inside of his eyelids. She did not pause. Another photo slammed onto the table, followed by another and another, a relentless cascade of memories he had buried under bravado and brutality. Each image was a testimony, each frozen face a courtroom of its own. The woman's voice finally cut through, sharp as a guillotine. "Do you remember this boy?" she asked, her words slicing into his flesh more deeply than any blade could hope to. His lips trembled, soundless syllables bubbling in the back of his throat as he shook his head in frantic denial. A third photo landed, the face of a middle-aged man contorted in horror, blood smearing across his forehead like a grotesque crown. His hands had been frozen mid-defensive gesture, fingers clawing at a phantom attacker. The man on the floor let out a hoarse, strangled sound, somewhere between a moan and a scream, his arms curling around his torso in a pitiful attempt to armor himself against the avalanche of his crime. She leaned in closer, the dossier now a weapon wielded with surgical precision. With almost reverent care, she drew the next image from the folder. A young black girl, her cheek caved in where his boot had met her skull. Her hair sprawled like a black halo around her blood-streaked face, her eyes forever frozen in a mix of terror and disbelief. The woman's hand trembled slightly, not from fear, but from the magnitude of the injustice she was about to unleash. Her voice rose, each syllable hammered into the marble like nails into a coffin. "Aaliyah Roberts," she said, her voice echoing against the walls, ricocheting in the hollows of his mind. 15 years old. You thought no one would remember her name. The man's scream finally tore free, a hideous, unfiltered howl that rattled the gallery seats and sent a cold shiver down every spine present. His body jerked violently, knees slamming against the floor, hands slapping the ground as though he might break through to some lower layer of reality where these ghosts wouldn't follow. "No, no more. I don't want to see. I don't want to remember," he shrieked, spittle flying, the veins in his neck bulging like ropes about to snap. She tilted her head slightly, her expression a dark mirror reflecting every ounce of his guilt. "You will remember," she declared, her voice a blade tempered in every scream he had silenced. "Every face, every scream, every last breath you stole. They will haunt you until your final gasp." Her words poured into him, filling the hollow spaces he had carved out for his pride and cruelty, each sentence of venom that rotted him from the inside out. He clawed at his temples, fingernails raking deep furrows into his scalp, as though he could dig out the memories she forced upon him. Blood trickled down his forehead, mingling with sweat and tears in a grotesque baptism of his own making. His wails rose higher, desperate and childlike, a pitiful plea that found no mercy in her gaze. The camera zoomed in, each frame capturing the raw collapse of a tyrant confronted with the pure, undiluted horror of his past. She let the final photos fall from her fingers, each one landing like a thunderclap, a final judgment pronounced with silent authority. Her shoulders squared, her chin lifted, her eyes burning with a righteous flame that threatened to consume him whole. In that moment, she was not merely a witness or an avenger. She was the living embodiment of every voice he had silenced, every spirit he had broken, Every life he had twisted beyond recognition. He folded in on himself, face pressed to the floor, sobs echoing against the marble in grotesque waves. His fingers scraped across the photographs, smudging the ink, leaving bloody fingerprints like confession smeared in desperate strokes. But no amount of rubbing, no amount of screaming could erase the ghosts she had unleashed from the basement of his memory. They clung to him now, inseparable and eternal, the ultimate jury that would haunt every breath he managed to take from this moment forward. The final echo of his sobs still reverberated through the marble chamber when she reached into her pocket and drew out a small, unassuming mirror. Its edges were smooth, its silver back polished to a gleam that caught the harsh courtroom lights like a shard of moonlight in a starless sky. The glass surface glimmered with a cold, quiet threat more piercing than any blade, an unspoken promise to strip away every mask he had ever worn. Her fingers curled around the handle with a surgeon's precision, the weight of judgment heavy in her palm. He sensed her movement even before she stepped forward. His head jerked up instinctively, eyes wide, bloodshot, the pupils rolling like marbles in a storm. He flinched backward, shoulders scraping against the cold floor. But his escape was as pitiful as it was futile. She advanced with slow, inexorable grace, each footstep sounding like a funeral drum echoing inside his skull. Her eyes burned with a light that seemed to reach straight through his skin, illuminating every dark corner he had hoped to keep buried. When she reached him, she did not speak. Instead, she knelt, the movement smooth and deliberate, her presence closing in around him like a tightening vice. She raised the mirror, tilting it until the glass captured his face in its stark, merciless frame. The instant he saw himself, a strangled sound burst from his throat, a dry, hacking cry that dissolved into a wet, rattling cough. His gaze skittered across the mirror, trying to slip away, to find refuge in some hidden corner of the courtroom. But her free hand shot out, fingers digging into his hair with a force that pinned him in place. His neck strained under her grip, veins bulging like ropes beneath his thin, clammy skin. His entire body shivered violently, his legs jerking like a puppet yanked by invisible strings. His eyes flicked desperately from side to side, but her fingers only tightened, her nails biting into his scalp as though she meant to root him to the very floor. He whined, a thin, animalistic sound, the air catching in his throat as if it, too, recoiled from the reflection now dominating his field of vision. "Look at it," she commanded, her voice low and icy, each word carrying the weight of 1,000 verdicts. The mirror trembled slightly in her hand, reflecting every twitch, every convulsion, every tear streaking down his warped, blood-smeared face. His mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping on dry land, soundless syllables stuttering from his chapped lips. His pupils dilated, the whites of his eyes now streaked with crimson lines that webbed outwards like cracks in shattered glass. She leaned closer, her breath brushing against his cheek, her gaze unblinking and unrelenting. "Do you see it?" she whispered, her words slicing into the tender sinews of his already frayed mind. "This is the face of a man drunk on power, hollowed out by greed, abandoned by every scrap of soul you once had." Her tone twisted around him like a steel coil, each syllable tightening, pressing, suffocating. His head jerked violently, a choked sob splintering from deep within his chest. He spat a thin trail of blood down his chin, his eyes rolling so far back that only slivers of red remained visible. No, it's not me. I'm not him. The words dissolved into a whimper, drowned out by the gurgling of blood pooling at the corners of his lips. His hands clawed at the floor, fingers splayed wide, nails splitting as they scraped against the cold marble in desperate futility. She didn't flinch. Instead, she pressed the mirror closer, so near that the cold glass almost kissed his skin, so close he could feel its chill seep into his pores, etching the reflection into the marrow of his bones. "You killed yourself long before today," she hissed, her voice so soft it was almost tender, but beneath that softness pulsed a lethal finality. "This body, this trembling, pitiful husk, it's just a shell now, shivering in fear. The real you died the moment you chose to betray every last breath that begged for mercy." A strangled screech burst from him then, raw and guttural, echoing like a wild animal cornered and torn apart from the inside. His back arched violently, every muscle seizing in a grotesque dance of terror and self-loathing. His eyes remained locked on the mirror, unable to escape the truth clawing at his consciousness with merciless claws. The reflection shimmered with his shame, each twitch and shiver amplifying his downfall, until it filled the entire chamber. She held the mirror steady, her fingers white at the knuckles, her eyes sharp and cutting as obsidian. The room felt as though it had shrunk to just the two of them and the gleaming shard of glass, an arena where his soul was dragged, stripped, and dissected before an audience who needed no words to understand the gravity of the moment. The silence around them vibrated with a kind of reverence, as if they all bore witness to a sacred execution of spirit. His breathing came in ragged, hysterical waves, each inhale a confession, each exhale a plea that dissipated before it could ever reach forgiveness. Blood and spit pooled beneath his chin, dripped onto the marble floor, a grotesque mirror to the purity of the glass pressed against his skin. The mark on his forehead glowed crimson under the lights, a damning beacon that pointed back to every sin, every soul he had crushed beneath his boot. Finally, as if the last string inside him had snapped, his hands fell limp, his head lolled forward, forehead smacking softly against the glass in a final, hopeless surrender. His shoulders heaved once, twice, then stilled, each quiver smaller than the last, until he hung there, limp and hollow, the mirror still capturing the ruin of the man he once believed himself to be. She pulled the mirror away slowly, her movements precise and almost reverent, as though laying down the final piece of evidence in a long-awaited trial, long-awaited. Her gaze lingered on his collapsed form, eyes shimmering with an unyielding light that neither time nor pleas could ever diminish. In that mirror he had not merely seen his face, he had seen the graveyard of his soul, every forgotten scream, every muffled cry, every face he believed would vanish into the abyss of his memory, now resurrected in one final, damning reflection. The mirror's echo still shimmered in his glassy eyes as she lowered it, her fingers releasing their grip like a final scalpel, slicing away the last sinew of illusion. He slumped forward, forehead striking the cold floor with a soft, hollow thud, his breath rattling in uneven waves. The room, now an altar soaked in judgment, felt as if it had swallowed every ounce of oxygen. Every gaze, every lens, every soul present had turned into silent jurors, watching the final descent of a once feared tyrant into the abyss of his shame. A crimson drop escaped the corner of his mouth, slipping down his chin before releasing its weight onto the marble below. The sound of it landing, a sharp, wet slap, reverberated through the room like a death knell, a macabre metronome marking each moment of his collapse. Another droplet followed, then another, until a slow, rhythmic patter began, each splash a drumbeat punctuating his undoing. The floor beneath him transformed into a twisted stage, his blood painting a grotesque signature of confession across the cold stone. She moved with spectral calm, her hand reaching for the microphone that had lain forgotten on the judge's bench. The metallic glint of it caught the sterile overhead lights as she lifted it, her grip firm and unwavering. With a predator's grace, she descended to him, the cable trailing behind her like a snake, hissing with the promise of exposure. She crouched beside him, her knees sinking into the pool of his blood without a flinch, her immaculate white sleeves now streaked in crimson lines that marked her not as a victim, but as an avenging specter. With a single, fluid motion, she grabbed his chin, forcing his head upward, the whites of his eyes rolling as though he were on the brink of some final, unspoken horror. She brought the microphone to his trembling lips, its cold mesh grazing his split skin. Her voice was low, soft enough to feel intimate, yet powerful enough to crack the silence that suffocated the room. "Say it," she demanded, her tone slicing into him like a commandment etched into stone. "Say you betrayed the law." His lips quivered, a tremor that passed through his entire skeletal frame. At first, only a strangled breath escaped, a pathetic gasp that evaporated into the sterile air. But her fingers tightened around his jaw, nails biting into the tender flesh beneath his ear, grounding him to the moment. His eyes finally focused on her, shimmering with animal terror, his pupils shaking in shallow pools of crimson and despair. "Say it," she repeated, her voice now as inevitable and crushing as gravity. He swallowed, the motion jagged, his Adam's apple bobbing like a lifeline slipping beneath the waves. Finally, a broken sound clawed its way out of his throat. I betrayed the law," he croaked, each word dissolving into a sob that convulsed his body from the inside out. Courtroom held its breath, a collective inhalation so sharp it might have shattered glass. The echo of his confession lingered in the stale air, a ghost now set free to roam every dark corner he once believed belonged to him. She did not release him. Instead, she leaned closer, her voice dropping even lower, its chill wrapping around his spine like a noose. "Louder," she commanded, the word echoing like a cannon blast inside his skull, for the entire city to hear, for every mother who lost her child, for every cry you buried beneath your boots. "Louder!" His head twitched violently, as if fighting an invisible swarm, his lips peeling back in a grimace that bordered on animalistic. Then, in a final, hoarse scream that cracked under its weight, he howled, "I betrayed the law!" His voice tore through the courtroom, reverberating through the microphones, and spilling out into the world beyond those marble walls, broadcast to every screen, every speaker, every hidden ear that had ever dared to doubt his guilt. Silence fell like an executioner's axe the moment his scream ended. The only sound was his ragged breathing, the slow drip of blood that continued its steady rhythm onto the floor. Her hand released his jaw at last, his head collapsing forward, chin hitting his chest with a dull, defeated thud. The microphone slid from her grip, clattering softly onto the marble, a gentle punctuation mark on the symphony of his ruin. She rose then, her posture regal, unbroken, the stains of his blood a testament to the war she had waged and won without flinching. Her eyes swept across the crowd, meeting every shocked, tear-glazed stare, each camera lens, each quivering breath. In that gaze was an unspoken decree. There would be no forgetting, no rewriting of this moment. This was not merely a confession, it was a crucifixion on a stage of his own making. The audience stood frozen, some with hands clasped over their mouths, others trembling in silent catharsis. The courtroom had become a living mausoleum, each heartbeat a drumbeat to the fall of a tyrant. His body trembled beneath her like an empty husk, each sob a final echo of a man who once believed he was invincible, now reduced to a puddle of blood and regret beneath the unyielding stare of justice incarnate. His final, pitiful confession still echoed in the hallowed chamber when she moved, her body slicing through the thick silence like a blade honed by centuries of rage and righteousness. She stepped forward, her boots sending ripples across the pool of his blood beneath her feet, each stride echoing like a funeral drum. Her fingers reached for his chest, the nameplate pinned to his uniform, that last scrap of false glory clinging to the ruin of his identity. The metal glinted under the harsh lights, catching each flicker of his trembling body, each spasm of his shallow, broken breath. She paused for a heartbeat, her eyes locking onto the plate as if peering into the dark heart of every lie he had ever uttered. Then, with a sharp tug, she ripped it free. The sound of tearing metal split the air, sharp and violent, like bone cracking under an executioner's axe. In her hand, the nameplate looked fragile, a worthless relic that had masqueraded as power. She held it aloft for all to see, turning it slowly so each letter reflected the sterile, unfeeling light, a final, bitter joke scrawled across a counterfeit crown. Without a flicker of hesitation, she brought her hands together, bending the plate until it groaned and snapped. The shards gleamed like splintered teeth in her palm. One by one, she let the pieces fall, each fragment hitting the marble floor with a cold, sharp ring. They scattered across the blood-slick stage like ashes of a burnt offering, each shard a piece of a legacy now ground into dust. Her movements were deliberate, ceremonial, a ritual dismantling of the illusion he had worn like armor. He watched, his eyes wide and glossy, his mouth forming silent, cracked pleas that died before they could touch the air. His face twisted in agony, his cheeks streaked with spit, blood, and tears. He dropped his forehead to the floor again, a hoarse, infantile cry seeping from deep within him, a sound so raw it clawed at the bones of everyone present. He curled inward, his spine arching like a tortured animal, fingers clawing desperately at the floor as if to dig himself into the ground and disappear. She turned then, her steps slow but unyielding, and ascended the judge's dais. Each step was heavy with the finality of a death knell, her silhouette towering above the broken figure below. When she reached the top, she turned to face him, looking down with an expression that was neither pity nor rage, but something far colder, an unwavering acknowledgement of absolute truth. The room fell into a deeper silence, as if the very walls leaned in to hear her final pronouncement. Her voice rose, rich and resonant, vibrating through the chamber like a cathedral bell at midnight. "From this moment on," she declared, each word echoing with the weight of an ancient curse, "you have no name, you have no past, you are nothing, no history, no memory, no trace in the ledger of this world." Her words shattered the last remnants of his identity, ripping away the thin veil that had clung to him like a dying shadow. A clerk standing to the side stepped forward, his hands shaking as he lifted a thick, official ledger, a book that recorded every name, every deed, every title that had once defined the hierarchy of this fractured empire. The clerk opened it slowly, his breath ragged with disbelief and fear. He flipped to the page where the man's name was scrawled in bold ink, that single word once inflated with the arrogance of a self-made god. The clerk drew a red pen, hesitated for a heartbeat, then dragged the line through the name with a slow, grinding finality. The ink bled into the paper like a fatal wound, the red line crossing out not just a name, but an entire existence. Then, with a trembling hand, the clerk signed beneath the line, "Erased, forever." The word gleamed under the lights, a single, irreversible decree that reverberated like a thunderclap through the silent congregation. Below, the man let out a shriek, high-pitched, animal, his body convulsing in spasms so violent he nearly slammed his head against the marble floor. He lunged forward, dragging himself across the blood-slicked tiles, his fingers slipping and scraping as he reached out for the shards of his nameplate scattered before him. Each desperate crawl was met with nothing but the echo of his disgrace, each gasp choked by the weight of a world that no longer acknowledged his presence. He managed to reach one shard, fingers curling around it as if it were a life raft in a sea of oblivion. But as he tried to bring it closer, a boot slammed down onto his wrist, pinning him in place. The crack of bone echoed softly as he let out a howl that split the air. She stood above him, foot pressed into his flesh with the cold precision of execution. Her eyes bore into his, sharp and merciless, holding him pinned not just physically but in spirit. Her voice dropped to a whisper, so soft it barely reached beyond his broken form. "You will not take even a fragment of that lie with you," she murmured, each syllable slicing into him like a surgeon's blade. His fingers spasmed once more, the shards slipping from his grasp, clinking against the marble as it joined the rest of his shattered legacy. He collapsed entirely then, his body folding in on itself, his forehead pressing into the floor in a grotesque parody of prayer. His sobs turned to quiet gurgles, each one weaker than the last, each breath a testament to the final, irreversible execution of the only thing he had ever truly worshipped, his name. His body lay crumpled beneath her shadow, the sobs echoing like the last dying whispers of a funeral procession. Every shard of his nameplate gleamed around him like shattered stars, reminders of a constellation of power that had once defined his universe and now lay at his feet. reduced to meaningless dust. His fingers twitched, scraping at the cold floor as though trying to grasp even a splinter of the illusion he had worshipped. The air felt thick enough to drown in, every breath from the audience suspended in reverence or horror, or both. He shifted slightly, eyes glazed, lips quivering as if dredging words from a mind torn to ribbons. Finally, a fragile, broken whisper crawled from his mouth, each syllable dripping with a grotesque mix of desperation and delusion. "I can fix this. Please give me a chance." His voice fractured, echoing against the marble like a ghost mocking itself. The words sounded foreign even to him, a last pathetic gasp at redemption from a man who had forfeited the right to even dream of it. She tilted her head slightly, studying him as one might observe a dying insect flailing on a pin. Her lips curled upward into a slow, deliberate smile, but it carried no warmth, only the cold edge of scorn, sharpened by countless wounds. Her eyes glittered, hard as obsidian, reflecting every plea, every betrayal, every silent scream he had ever harvested. With a slow, graceful precision, she shook her head, the motion cutting through him like a scalpel, each degree a deeper slice into the last shreds of his hope. "You think justice is a performance," she said, her voice low and smooth, every word flowing like poisoned honey. "A show that resets when the curtains close. A game you can replay until the audience tires and you get your encore." Her words wrapped around him like chains, each sentence tightening, each pause suffocating. "But justice isn't a stage. It is final. It is absolute. And tonight there is no encore for you." A convulsion seized him, his entire frame shuddering violently as if struck by an invisible blade. His eyes rolled, breath coming in short, choked gasps that rattled like broken glass inside his lungs. He turned his head frantically, eyes darting across the courtroom in wild, feral desperation, as though hoping to find a door, a window, a crack in the wall through which he might slither out and escape the iron grip of his fate. His gaze landed on a small glint at the edge of the room. Phone, left behind on a bench, its screen faintly illuminated like a lighthouse in a storm. A flicker of something, not quite courage, more like raw, instinctual panic, surged through him. With a sudden burst of motion, he lunged forward, fingers clawing at the floor, his nails screeching against the marble in a chorus of agony. He dragged himself forward inch by inch, the muscles in his arms convulsing, each movement more pitiful than the last. Sweat and blood smeared beneath him, leaving a crimson trail that looked more like the path of a dying animal than the final charge of a fallen titan. She watched him in silence, the corner of her lip twitching upward in a cruel, knowing amusement. Every eye in the room followed his pitiful crawl, each witness frozen in a tableau of disbelief and grim satisfaction. As his fingers finally scraped the edge of the bench, his breath hitched, a sob of relief cracking through his dry, torn throat. He reached for the phone, fingertips trembling, as though he believed that in its cold glass lay a last spark of salvation. But before his fingers could close around the device, her boot came down with ruthless precision. The heel struck his hand with a sickening crunch, the sound echoing like a gunshot in the dead stillness. A sharp animal scream tore from his throat as bones shifted and splintered beneath her weight. His fingers splayed, twitching helplessly, the phone now just inches away but more unreachable than salvation itself. She leaned forward, her voice a silk-wrapped dagger. "The doors are locked," she whispered, each syllable pressing deeper into his soul than any blade could pierce flesh. "No one is coming for you. No audience, no allies, no saviors hiding behind screens or uniforms. Only you, your sins, and the silence you once imposed on so many." Her words curled around his ears, sliding beneath his skin, burning through every nerve until he trembled not just in pain, but in an understanding so deep it threatened to shatter what little was left of his mind. He gasped, mouth opening in a silent plea, eyes wild and unfocused. His broken hand twitched beneath her boot, spasming in grotesque waves as if trying to swim through the very floor to escape. His body sagged forward, forehead thudding against the marble with a hollow, echoing crack. His sobs now came in wet, guttural gurgles, each one punctuated by a tremor that rattled down his spine like the last convulsions of a dying beast. She stood tall above him, her figure backlit by the harsh courtroom lights, casting a long, imposing shadow that seemed to consume his crumpled form entirely. Her gaze was unwavering, her breathing steady, each exhale a silent declaration of finality. In that moment, she was no longer just an avenger. She was an executioner, an embodiment of cosmic balance, an inevitable consequence incarnate. Her boot pressed down once more, firm and deliberate, sending another wave of agony through his mangled hand and up into his skull, breaking the last illusions of escape he might have nursed. His head snapped up briefly, eyes meeting hers one last time. In those fractured seconds, 1,000 unspoken apologies, excuses, and self-delusions flashed across his face before dissolving into a single, universal truth. He was alone, utterly, irrevocably alone. And as her foot ground his hand into the cold marble one final time, every last flicker of false hope evaporated, leaving behind only the quivering wreckage of a man who had finally realized that there was no script left to follow, no final act, no redemption arc, only the crushing, immutable weight of justice. The last echo of his shattered hope still vibrated through the stone hall when the lights began to dim, fading in slow, deliberate pulses as though the building itself were exhaling its final, exhausted breath. One by one, the bright overhead fixtures flickered out, surrendering to an oppressive gloom that crawled along the walls like a living shadow. Only a few pale amber security lights remained, casting long, ghostly fingers across the marble floor and transforming the once grand courtroom into a spectral crypt, a mausoleum for the living dead. He lay curled in a trembling heap against the far wall, every breath a wet, ragged stutter of despair. His arms wrapped around his legs, knees pulled so tightly to his chest that his bones looked ready to splinter from the pressure. The red brand still seared across his forehead, now a mocking crown in the dim, trembling glow. His teeth chattered violently, each clack echoing in the silence like distant gunshots in an abandoned city. The faint yellow light caught the sheen of sweat coating his face, creating the illusion of a wax figure melting slowly under an unseen flame. Somewhere deep in his throat, words began to fester and claw their way to the surface. "Mom, Mom, please," he croaked, the sound more a strangled mule than language. The syllables trembled into the darkness, vanishing before they could find comfort. He pressed his forehead against the cold wall, his spine arching in spasms that resembled the final throes of a dying animal. His hands clawed at the air, fingers twitching, as though trying to grasp memories, now dissolving like mist in the morning sun. Across the room, she sat in an old wooden chair, her posture erect, her breath slow and even. Her eyes were two black lanterns, unwavering beacons that cut through the darkness and pinned him to the ground like a specimen on a dissecting table. She did not speak, did not blink. Her silence was louder than any scream, a quiet so absolute it filled every crack of his mind with dread. Her presence felt less human than elemental, an immovable force of nature embodying the unyielding judgment that had finally cornered him. Above them, a speaker crackled to life, the static grinding into his skull with the subtlety of a serrated blade. And then, his voice, twisted and exposed, spilled into the room in a ceaseless loop. "I betrayed the law, I betrayed the law, I betrayed the law." The phrase repeated over and over, each iteration gnawing deeper into his psyche, each syllable hammering his shame into the marrow of his bones. At first he shook his head violently, the motion sharp and desperate, as though trying to fling the words out of his ears. But the voice was inescapable, a toxic echo seeping into every pore, every nerve. His breathing grew harsher, ragged inhalations that tore through his chest like shrapnel. He pushed his palms against his ears, nails digging into his scalp, leaving angry red crescents behind. Still, the loop continued, relentless and infinite, a waterfall of guilt crashing down on a mind already splintering. "Please," he choked out, his voice thin and broken, echoing off the empty seats like a dying echo in a vast canyon. "Please, stop. I can't. I'll do anything. Please." His forehead smashed against the wall with a dull, sickening thud. Once, twice, 3 times. Each impact painted a new constellation of blood across the pale marble, each crack a silent testament to the unraveling of a man who once believed himself untouchable. Across from him, she remained unmoving. Her gaze anchored him to reality, forcing him to endure every loop, every confession, every painful replay of his downfall. In that sterile, suffocating space, she became less a woman and more an embodiment of cosmic reckoning. Every flicker of the security lights etched her outline in brutal detail, a ghostly judge who refused to vanish into the dark. Her breath was the ticking of a clock that counted down not to salvation, but to an endless descent into oblivion. He convulsed again, shoulders jerking in violent spasms as he pressed his head harder against the wall, the bones of his skull reverberating with each collision. His cries collapsed into guttural sobs, a sound so raw it seemed to drag at the very air around him. His mouth foamed, his voice reduced to a brittle rasp, the once commanding tone now dissolved into the desperate squeals of an abandoned creature. The room grew colder, the shadows crawling higher along the walls like a rising tide. The echo of his repeated confession merged with the rattling of his breath, weaving an unholy symphony that wrapped around him like a funeral shroud. Every new pass of his voice from the speaker felt like a fresh blade scraping against an already flayed mind. The words lost their shape, turning into a droning mantra that seeped into the cracks of his consciousness, filling them with an acid that devoured any remaining illusion of innocence. She watched every moment, every twitch, her stare as sharp as a blade dipped in ice. She did not interfere, did not offer him the mercy of a final blow or the kindness of averted eyes. Instead, she let him drown in the tide of his confession, forced him to wear his guilt like a skin he could neither shed nor escape. Each loop of the recording added a new layer to his torment, each echo a nail hammered deeper into the coffin of his soul. "Please, please," he whimpered again, the words slithering out between blood-soaked lips. His hands slid weakly down the wall, smearing streaks of red in trembling lines. His head lolled to the side, his vision fracturing into shards of light and darkness. The room twisted around him, the repeated mantra from the speakers now indistinguishable from the screams echoing inside his skull. His final sobs hiccuped in the back of his throat, gurgling and wet, punctuating each dying breath. Hours passed, though he could no longer measure them. Time had collapsed into a singularity, each second an eternity of self-inflicted damnation. Every heartbeat sounded like a drum announcing his burial, each pulse a reminder that he was still alive to endure another cycle of the living nightmare. The only constants in his fragmented universe were her unmoving figure and the looped voice that dragged him further into the abyss. In those moments, the courtroom was no longer a place of human judgment, but a purgatory sculpted by his sins, a chamber where the light never fully died, yet offered no warmth. Each flicker of yellow cast fresh shadows that danced like wraiths across the marble, whispering forgotten names he could no longer deny. And as his body crumpled further, spine bending and limbs twitching, his soul felt each whispered name as a blade drawn across its surface, cutting until nothing recognizable remained. In the corner, she watched, a silent witness to the final act of a man unmaking himself. Her breath, calm and unwavering, reverberated through the room like the eternal beat of a war drum. The finality of her gaze was more suffocating than any chain or cell could ever be. And as the night stretched on, endless and unmerciful, he remained trapped in that echo chamber of guilt, a man imprisoned not by bars, but by the unrelenting chorus of his own confessions, a prison built brick by brick from every scream he had silenced, now echoing back into the hollow shell of what was left of him. The echo of his confessions still hung thick in the stale dark air, every syllable an invisible chain coiling tighter around his soul, when the first fragile threads of morning light began to bleed through the high courtroom windows. The amber security lights flickered, sputtered, and finally surrendered to the pale embrace of dawn, leaving the chamber bathed in a cool, ethereal glow. The slow rise of the sun painted the marble floor in a wash of gentle gold, its rays stretching like cautious fingers across the battlefield of shattered identity and broken flesh. He stirred in the corner, his body now no more than a quivering husk, a shell emptied of all pretense and arrogance. With agonizing slowness, he began to move, each motion so brittle it threatened to shatter him entirely. His fingers clawed at the blood-slicked floor, leaving streaks that glowed faintly in the new light. His knees buckled as he attempted to rise, but his muscles betrayed him, trembling under the weight of endless guilt and exhaustion. Somewhere in the depths of his hollow gaze, the last embers of defiance had long since died, replaced by a cavernous emptiness that swallowed every thought, every memory, every echo of the man who once believed himself a god among mortals. His lips cracked, split open like dry earth, begging for rain, yet no words came, only shallow, rattling breaths that vibrated weakly in the cold morning air. He dragged himself forward, inch by excruciating inch, each movement a silent wail for mercy that would never come. His eyes, glazed and unfocused, reflected nothing of the marble grandeur or the streaming sunlight, only the deep, unending void of a spirit annihilated. At last, he collapsed at the center of the courtroom floor. His limbs splayed grotesquely, as if even gravity itself recoiled from touching his rotted soul. Across from him, she stood motionless beneath the slow, advancing warmth of the morning sun. Her white vest remained immaculate, the small flecks of blood now dried into near-invisible whispers on the fabric, symbols of a storm that had passed but left its mark on the world. The light enveloped her like a mantle, crowning her in a radiance that turned her from mere human into something elemental, justice incarnate, unwavering, eternal. Her eyes, dark and sharp as obsidian, held his broken form without a flicker of pity. Her chest rose and fell with the calm precision of someone who had breathed through centuries of storms, unbowed and unbroken. Her presence in that light became an unspoken sermon, an embodiment of a truth that no man, no scream, no plea could unmake. Slowly, with the unhurried grace of a queen descending her throne, she stepped forward. Each footfall was a soft percussion against the marble, echoing like the steady beat of a war drum that no longer needed to roar. Its victory had already been sung by the silence of the vanquished. As she closed the distance, the last remnants of his spirit seemed to shrink even further, folding in on themselves until he was nothing more than a shivering monument to his downfall. She stopped beside him, her gaze lowering to the pitiful ruin sprawled at her feet. He lifted his head a fraction. The motion labored, his neck straining as though held up by invisible strings on the verge of snapping. Their eyes met, or rather his eyes, now dull, vacant, devoid of all human spark, stared into hers, two abysses finally colliding. In that final communion, 1,000 stories passed between them, none spoken aloud. The violence, the arrogance, the screams swallowed in the dark, and the justice long denied, all of it condensed into a single electric heartbeat beneath the rising sun. His mouth quivered as if to form words, but nothing emerged. There were no words left to summon, no lies to grasp, no apologies to forge from the dust of his soul. She inhaled deeply, as though tasting the new dawn, before speaking, her voice a clear, unwavering blade slicing through the quiet. "Justice does not end when the sun rises," she declared, her words rippling through the room, catching on every broken echo, every hidden camera, every trembling witness. "It begins." At that moment, he seemed to deflate entirely, the fragile scaffolding of his physical self giving way under the immense pressure of her verdict. His head dropped forward, forehead striking the marble with a hollow crack, his arms folding lifelessly beneath him. His body spasmed once, twice, then lay still, a final, pathetic echo of a man who had once believed himself immortal. Outside the towering glass windows, the city stirred to life. The sun climbed higher, igniting the skyscrapers and rooftops in a shimmering tapestry of gold and rose. Far below, Millions of screens flickered to life, each capturing and broadcasting the moment the Titan crumbled into dust. The sight of his final surrender traveled across highways and alleyways, through cramped apartments and gleaming offices, searing itself into the hearts and minds of a nation that had long hungered for this reckoning. She stood there in the radiant pool of morning light, figure unbending, her gaze still fixed on the fallen figure before her. Around them, the air shimmered with the silent, electric promise of a new era, one defined not by fear or oppression, but by the quiet, unyielding might of truth finally laid bare. In that stillness, a profound hush swept across every watching soul, a shared intake of breath that marked the birth of something beyond vengeance, something purer, harder, and far more enduring. And as the first full rays of sunlight crowned her like a celestial diadem, the world watched and understood. Justice had not merely been served, it had been reborn. He lay unmoving, a dark silhouette against the polished marble, no longer a man but an artifact of a time that would never return, and in that contrast, her radiant defiance against his final, pitiful collapse. There was no need for further words, no call for applause or explanation. The moment was a monument carved into the collective memory, an immovable testament to what it meant when truth rose like the sun and burned away every shadow. This was the dawn of truth, blinding, merciless, and beautiful beyond measure. And in that dawn, she stood alone, silent, unyielding, eternal. The courtroom stood frozen, bathed in the pale aftermath of dawn, every surface still echoing the silent thunder of his collapse. The smell of blood clung to the air, sharp and metallic, mingling with the sterile scent of marble and the faint electric hum of cameras still recording, still bearing witness to the ultimate unraveling of a once invincible facade. She stood motionless at the center, her posture impossibly straight, her vest now a tapestry of dried blood and dawn's glow, each stain a testament to the war that had been fought not with bullets, but with truth sharper than any blade. The microphone trembled slightly in her grip, a black sentinel that had carried its confessions into every corner of the world. Her eyes, cold and bright as polished steel, swept across the chamber, taking in every tremor, every held breath, every shocked, wide-eyed spectator, silently translating her victory into the language of their private hopes and fears. Without ceremony, she raised the microphone one last time, her fingers tightening around it as though wringing the last drop of venom from a serpent's fang. Then, in one smooth, almost casual motion, she tore it from its wire and hurled it onto the judge's bench. The sound of it crashing onto the polished wood exploded like a gunshot in the cavernous hall, reverberating against the walls until it seemed the entire building trembled in response. The microphone landed with a final metallic clatter, a punctuation mark on a story that had been written in sweat, screams, and shattered illusions. Behind her, he was dragged forward, each movement a grotesque pantomime of life, though no spark remained in those once arrogant eyes. His feet scraped across the marble, leaving thin streaks of dried blood and dirt in their wake, each mark a fragile echo of the power he had wielded and lost. His mouth hung open, dry and cracked, no sound escaping but a low, rattling gurgle that spoke not of defiance or regret, but of a soul already abandoned to the endless night. His head lolled forward, chin nearly touching his chest, as though the simple act of holding it upright had become too heavy for a spirit now gutted and void. On the far wall, etched deep into the marble as if clawed by an immortal hand, were the words, "No one stops me until today." The letters seemed to shimmer in the shifting morning light, each stroke of the chisel a scar carved into the nation's collective memory. That single line became a monument, a silent guardian standing vigil over every future betrayal, every future lie. It declared to all who dared enter, Power, no matter how vicious, no matter how absolute it believes itself to be, will one day kneel. She turned, the slow pivot of her body a final act of dominion over the space she had conquered. The light caught in the contours of her vest, glinting off the crusted blood as though it were a warrior's ceremonial armor, polished by the first rays of a righteous dawn. Each step she took forward resonated like a drumbeat against the marble, a quiet war song echoing in the chests of those who watched, their hearts thrumming in rhythm with her unwavering march. A hush fell as a single voice rose from the corner, tentative and quivering, yet propelled by an urgency that no longer feared consequence. A journalist, clutching his microphone like a torch, dared to break the heavy silence. "What do you want to say to the nation?" His words hovered in the air, fragile and electric, as though the entire country leaned in through that one trembling question. She paused mid-step, her profile cutting a sharp silhouette against the gleaming marble and sun-washed windows. Her gaze shifted over her shoulder, settling on the reporter with a force that nearly buckled his knees. Then, slowly, deliberately, her lips curved into a faint, almost imperceptible smile, the kind that carried no warmth, only the gravity of a truth too heavy for most to bear. Her voice emerged low and calm, each word a chisel strike against the brittle illusion of safety. "Do not close your eyes when justice is strangled," she said, her tone as smooth as silk drawn across a blade, each syllable sinking into the marrow of every listener. The sentence hung in the air, suspended like the final note of a symphony that reverberates long after the instruments have fallen silent. She turned back without waiting for a reply, her steps carrying her forward with the finality of a blade drawn across an executioner's block. Each echo of her movement was a farewell to an old world and an invocation to the new, an unspoken challenge thrown into the face of complacency and cowardice. Her figure receded through the columns of light, the morning sun catching on the last wet edge of her stained vest, transforming her into an ethereal sentinel, passing beyond the reach of cameras, beyond the reach of any mortal grasp. Behind her he sagged even further, knees buckling as guards struggled to keep him upright. His eyes, vacant and glassy, remained fixed on the etched words above, the mantra that now owned him, body and soul. His mouth twitched as though trying to form words, but only a thin string of drool slipped past his lips, trailing down his chin to vanish into the torn remains of his uniform. In that final degradation, every echo of his past life, every threat, every smirk, every lie evaporated, like mist before the rising sun. The courtroom, once a fortress of deceit and corruption, now stood transformed into a cathedral of reckoning. Each camera, each screen across the nation, transmitted this living requiem into homes, offices, and streets. The phrase on the wall blazed in the morning light, etched into every retina, every trembling heart. "No one stops me." Until today, it would not be a headline easily forgotten, nor a slogan soon diluted by politics or whispers. It had become a covenant, a vow, burned into the national conscience. She moved past the final row of benches, each step echoing a slow heartbeat that would linger in the bones of all who witnessed. Her presence remained, even as her figure disappeared through the open archway, a lingering shadow that would haunt cowards and empower the silent righteous. When the last of her echo faded, the audience finally exhaled, a collective shiver traveling down every spine. Some wept openly. Others stood paralyzed, each person clutching their private reckoning, their own whispered promise to never close their eyes again. The sun now blazed fully through the windows, illuminating every corner, every stain, every truth laid bare in the unrelenting light. That was her final legacy, not a speech etched into a plaque, nor a monument cast in bronze. Her legacy was alive, breathing in the trembling chests of a nation newly awake. It would move in every sideways glance at a uniform, every whispered question in a dark alley, every protest sign raised against a sky that once seemed deaf. Her words, her final step, her unwavering gaze, these were her gifts to a people who had forgotten that power was not immortal, and that silence was not safety but surrender. This was the final act, the last testament of a story too brutal to be fiction and too necessary to be ignored. She left behind no statues, no medals pinned to her chest, only the raw, searing truth that justice is not a relic, but a living creature that demands eyes open, voices raised, and spines unbowed. In the quiet that followed her departure, a new dawn stretched its fingers across the city, crawling into every shadow that had once harbored secrets. And though she had walked away, the echo of her final words, "Do not close your eyes when justice is strangled," reverberated endlessly, a vow stitched into the very marrow of a nation that had finally learned to watch.